Hello and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another Historical Humans Reacts. And on today's episode, we are looking at how the world's earliest writing system may have been influenced by older symbols found on stone cylinder seals. Wow, that's a hard one to say.
Oh,
Stone
yes,
cylinder
yes.
seals.
Yes, thank you for that, Sylvester. I'm sure Tweety Bird is very happy.
Stone cylinder seals.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tongue twister. But basically, one of the questions in archaeology is how did writing come about? That's a very important historical question. And the prevailing theory and what this article talks about there being increasing evidence for is the idea of a sort of ledger system where you would make marks to note that you were paying for something and what you were paying for and how much of it you had bought or sold eventually would evolve into things like numbers and words. The drawing of the ox becomes an abstract symbol that means ox, which in turn becomes letters and words that mean ox.
It's very interesting because you can trace the origin of certain languages to systems similar to this. I mean, to have a syllabary, which is what the symbols that have meanings end up being called, it's a challenge. I mean, it's a system that's usually devised over a series of generations of evolution, and to see this where these images are carved into cylinders and then rolled onto wet clay to make the impression, to make the mark, is quite ingenious because that's a very simple system and it's an easy way to keep track. And we do tend to notice that a lot of times written language tends to spawn because of administrative purposes. Records, tally books, a lot of times government documentation. In other places of the world, instead of having a system with the cylinders, you would see very similar things being done with like knots or with oh, knots are the biggest one I'm thinking about, the
Um,
Inca. But
yeah,
there's
the
other
Incan.
systems similar where they make notches and marks and tally sticks even.
Yeah, yeah, beads. Just
Beads are,
in
yep,
general,
that's
the
another one.
concept of an abacus, where you are moving different scaled beads on a chart to mark how much of one thing is there is.
So it's very interesting, and this specific article talks about how this is a transition between prehistory and history. And for those of you playing at home, that's usually the point in which we tend to make that differentiation of history versus prehistory, is whether or not there are legitimate written histories about the period. And obviously that gets kind of hazy and changes depending on region, but it all boils down the same. And one of the earliest forms of actual writing that we have is cuneiform, which was invented around 3100 BCE in Mesopotamia. And even before that, that's the first official written language they had, Proto Cuneiform, that appeared a couple hundred years earlier that featured symbols. Again, going back to this impression cylinder that you're able to rub onto wet clay.
Yeah, yeah. So like the general origin of language as writing is established that cuneiform is the first 5100 years ago, and it was undergoing a transition period from just simple symbology into what we would understand as a language, starting in 3350 BC and ending at 3000 BC. The cylinder that the archaeologists have found dates from anywhere between 3400 BC and 4400 BC, meaning it could quite possibly mark a much longer and broader transition period than what we've previously understood. This would be what the symbols were before they became proto cuneiform, before the concept of making it into a written language existed and was just an idea of put symbol down, mean thing.
Well, the interesting thing and what the real meat and potatoes of this article is they actually looked at the symbols on those early cylinders to ones that were used in proto cuneiform and even in cuneiform, and they noticed similarities among the symbols, meaning that people didn't really change it. They just kind of adapted it for their purpose, and it continued on. So there are some elements of that original first language that are still there. And in both instances of one of the examples that they have, both the symbols refer to the transportation of goods, and that helped continue that idea, how that abstract idea have a link to signs that these same concepts were being communicated just in different ways. It's an interesting way to show how language develops and how these systems develop, how these writing systems actually evolve. And it's kind of interesting because you can look at modern examples for a comparative analysis and see this translation. I mean, you can look at indigenous nations that have developed their own languages, their own syllabaries, their own alphabets. You see the process in which they're developed, and you're able to almost reverse engineer it. It's very interesting, and it gives us an inclination as to how things evolve over time as well, because obviously we have a lot of examples of cuneiform, but we don't exactly have the full picture of what proto-cuneiform looked like, or what it actually looked like in its very basic state.
Yeah, what evolved into cuneiform? That is the question, because there had to be generations of human beings drawing an ox and saying that means ox, and then changing the drawing to make it easier to replicate over and over and over again until it becomes an abstract representation that is then seen in cuneiform. That becomes, the symbol in the language to mean the object instead of just being a pictogram. It's a how do we get from A to B kind of question, and these roles are the answer.
And what's kind of interesting is the cylinders give that answer, but they also kind of tell a whole different story that is very interesting, in that the development of cuneiform as a language, or proto-cuneiform, was more decentralized. It wasn't one institution or figure pushing the changes. It was more universal. It was more decentralized, which kind of shows a certain democratization of this process and of this information. And the fact that it disseminated so widely so quickly also gives indication that there was a willingness and want for this, and a need for it to develop, that people put the time investment into continue on developing it, but to have it in such widespread use case applications.
It's definitely a matter of thousands of scribes across the entirety of Mesopotamia over generations, just slowly changing how they did things to make it, in the most human sense, easier on themselves to write the same thing 100 times.
But I think that's actually a great point for us to end today's episode. Thank you guys for watching. Let us know what you thought down below, and we'll see you in the next one.